Hey guys, hope you're all doing okay. Welcome to the complete setup guide for CEMU. In this tutorial video, you're going to find everything that you need to know about this emulator. How to set up the emulator, what do all the options mean? This is going to be a detailed video and I'm going to put timestamps in the description. I do, however, recommend watching the whole video to get the full context. So without further ado, let's get started. To give you a little idea, here are the minimum specifications for the emulator, and we're going to call it low end, and anything above that is mid end, and if you have a really high end PC, that's high end as always. The specifications states that you can run it on Intel onboard graphics, but I wouldn't recommend this as performance varies from title to title. But if you have a competent dedicated graphics card, then this emulator shouldn't be a problem at all. If I had to choose the emulator which was the fastest and most efficient in its development process, I would say it's CEMU. I've been monitoring its builds since 2015 and since then it has come a long way. But even in that year, it was capable of booting lightweight titles, while other emulators in its inception years can only partially run the firmware of the console. It's mostly because it's a handheld device and PS3, PS2 are full-fledged consoles. The architecture is also relatively new, but it's not as weird as PS3 and PS2s. Massive thank you to the developers, Patreons, and the community. So to get started, we need to go to cemu.info. So let's go here and download the latest build revision. So if you go here, download, then we can download it from here. If you want to support the emulation scene and get those build revisions a week early, I think there is also a dedicated compatibility guide. So if you want to get those revisions early, you can donate and become a Patreon, so that you get them a week early. Anyways, I was talking about the compatibility section. In here you can see which games are playable and which are just perfect is 10% and playable is 34%. So perfect means that it is absolutely indistinguishable from the console. So if you're running the game on the emulator, you cannot tell whether it's running on the emulator or the console itself. Playable at 34%, that means that you can play the game from start to finish with some minor issues. So if you have a competent PC, you can play them from start to finish with some minor bugs. And you can download it from here. So after you've downloaded, you can extract it in any folder. So I already have it here, so that's why I'm not going to download. There is one prerequisite, I would say. It's Microsoft C++ Redistributable 2017. So it's Visual C++ Pack 2017 that you have to install. Otherwise, this emulator is going to give you an error. I would recommend that you install 2010 to 2019 Visual C++ Redistributables, both x86 and x64. So if you search for that on the internet, I think you can find a whole package. So just one executable file that it's going to install all of the redistributables just in one package. Because most of the emulators run on C++ and it needs to access some specific libraries and header files that are in those packages. So I already have that installed and I'm gonna launch it here. So I only have one game that I like to play. I wanted to play Zelda Breath of the Wild, but I didn't get around to it. One more thing that I would like to mention is when you have the perfect configuration for your emulator, it is always a good idea to make an archive. So I've already made an archive back in 2020. It's almost a year-old archive, and it contains my perfect configuration, and I made a WinRAR archive. So if in the future revisions they remove a feature or the performance goes down, because in rare cases it happens. It doesn't happen that often, but sometimes you'll find that a title that used to run faster on a previous revision, it's not running as fast in the future revision because they have made some optimizations. that are not compatible with that title. So I always like to make an archive, so if things go south I can just extract the contents from this one. Okay, so this is our emulator and I'm gonna go through the UI right now. So in file we have load, and in load you can load the RPX file. So for Wii U games you're gonna have a directory, and in code directory, so within that directory you're gonna have a subdirectory called code, and then in that directory you can have RPX file that you can execute. Install game title update or DLC. You can install DLC or an update. It's an XML file. So if you want to download some DLC, or if you paid for some DLC in your Wii U console, you can dump that in here, and it's going to give you an XML file and you can install that here. So far so good. This gives you your recent game, so I only have one. I'm gonna go into options later. First I want to go into tools. There is a memory searcher. So when a game is running and you want to look for some specific contents, you can do memory search. It's only for debugging purposes. So for example, I want to know that in a specific area my game crashes. So I can have the memory searcher running in the background and I can see that exact moment, what happened. And in the title manager, you can manage your title, import, install title, stuff like that. NFC, scan NFC tag from file. So I think this is to replicate the Wii U functionality. So if you have NFC content on your computer, you can dump them into this emulator. Not that useful, to be honest, I haven't really used it. And then we have our debugging section. So we have logging. These are all our API loggings: audio input, GX2, graphics one, core init, it's a C++ function. So all of these will let you log all of those API calls, or whatever it's doing, whatever the emulator is doing regarding that API, it's going to be logged. This is only for debugging purposes. It's not going to improve your performance, and I would recommend that leaving all of them off, because logging is an additional task. It doesn't take that much of a hit on your performance, but again, it is an additional task. So if you want that most performance, make sure none of them are enabled unless you're a developer or doing some debugging. Graphic pack patches. I don't think there is anything in that. Then we have texture cache warnings. Again, these are all for logging purposes, debug purposes. Dump, if you want to dump your textures into files, then you can have a look. Then you can select these options. Render upside down, again for debugging purposes. I don't think there's any practicality of rendering a title upside down. View PPC threads. So it's going to show you all your, I think it's either GPU or CPU threads that are currently being used, and then you have your debugger, audio debugger, frame profiler, and dump current RAM. So whatever is running in your RAM, you can dump them into files, and then you can have a look. In help, we have check for updates. I've updated this emulator, so there are not that updates. There are no updates available right now, but you can always. I think the update cycle is 2 weeks, I believe, but it can vary. If they're implementing a new feature, then the time span can vary. Okay, what else do we need to cover? So in option we have console language, active account, the CEMU account that you have, input settings. These are our controllers. So we're gonna emulate Wii U gamepad and not these other controllers. You can also use V mode for those specific games that you require motion, so you can use that. Nunchuck and motion plus. So if you're that specific game, you might want to use V mode for better accuracy. But always use Wii U gamepad, and you can select all of them in here, your keys. We have all these controllers, and you can make different profiles. I have 2 profiles, A and S, and these are different profiles for different games. So I think that is it for our UI. Now let's go through options. First is full screen, pretty self-explanatory. Then we have graphics pack, separate gamepad view. If you want your gamepad view separate, like in here, then you can select this. So we have two left: graphic packs and input settings. General settings, sorry. So let's go through general settings. In our interface, we have default, and we're going to keep it default unless you want to select a default language. That's up to you. Remember main window position, remember pad window position, pretty self-explanatory. Discord presence is a feature. I think it's in Discord where Discord has a feature called rich Discord presence, and you can enable that if you want your gameplay integrated in Discord. I haven't used Discord, so for people who are into live streaming on Discord and want emulation and gameplays, so this might be the feature for them. Full screen menu bar, automatic check for updates. This is our game path, so I've given it a game path, and yep, that's it in this section. In our graphics API, we have OpenGL, and we have two: Vulkan Experimental and OpenGL. So this is the meat and potatoes of this tutorial. OpenGL was implemented in this emulator in 2015. So it had about 6 years of revisions and implementations and test revisions and bug fixes. So if you want the utmost performance and utmost accuracy, please go with OpenGL. We also have Vulkan. Vulkan was implemented back in 2019, at the end of 2019 or in the beginning of 2020. So it hasn't had that much of bug fixes and test implementations and revisions. So it's kind of ironic, because if you want the utmost performance, you always choose Vulkan. It is also faster in shader times. In shader compilation times, Vulkan is faster, but OpenGL has had so many build revisions that it is the best option to use right now. But if you have a mid-end PC and you want the faster FPS, and if you have Vulkan available, you will always choose Vulkan. I always choose OpenGL even on low-end PCs. So please keep that in mind. It will also depend on the title, so very few titles will need Vulkan, and they will not run on OpenGL. You might have some accuracy issues. So if you come across those titles or games, you can just change your settings here. Pre-compiled shaders are auto. I'm going to keep it to auto. So these are the shaders that your game is going to access while it's running from your shader bank. So I've already enabled it to auto. It's going to come in default, it's going to be selected to auto. VSync, if you have some screen tearing effects, you will enable that so you can minimize those effects. Even if I have screen tearing effects, I don't enable VSync. I never enable VSync because you get a toll on your performance, so always keep it off. I personally think that it's not worth it to get that hit in performance, and then you get a little bit of accuracy, so always prefer the FPS. Full sync at GX2 draw done. It's an OpenGL feature. So you see when you select Vulkan, it goes away. In OpenGL, we have full sync at GX2 draw done. It improves your accuracy when you're using OpenGL by synchronizing CPU and GPU I think implementations. So if you want better accuracy, you will select that, but it can take a toll on your performance, so keep that in mind. And in Vulkan, we have async shader compilation, and it can reduce your shader compilation times depending on the title. So if you're playing an RPG or like open world game like Breath of the Wild, definitely enable this. It will give you shorter compilation times, and it will give you a smoother experience overall. So you were at OpenGL, and it was selected by cubic, but I always select by linear, all of them. These are the upscaling techniques. Bicubic is going to use geometrical shapes to upscale your content, while bilinear is going to use horizontal and vertical lines, pixelated lines to upscale your content. And then you have the same thing for downscale filter. So always select these two because these have the best implementations. Nearest neighbor is a option where you have a texture and then you upscale it to the texture that's the nearest to that texture. So it's a bit complicated. And Hermite is kind of a hybrid. Full screen scaling, we can keep the aspect ratio of the game, or if you don't want the black bars on the left and right side of your screen, you can stretch your content. Then we have audio. So it was selected at this direct sound. It's a little bit old. It's a DirectX plugin. It's a little bit old. I always select X audio too. Then we have latency selected at 24 millisecond. Keep that selected because when you input something from your keyboard, it also has a latency. So if you want those two latency to synchronize, I think it's 24 milliseconds a sweet spot, but you can also increase or decrease it depending on your liking. And here you can select the device where you want your audio output to be, your gamepad. Overlay, if you want your FPS showing on the top left corner or the top right corner or the top center, or you want to disable it completely, it's up to you. It's not that much of a performance gain, but if you want the utmost performance, you want to squeeze every bit of I would say load from your CPU and GPU, keep that disabled. But I have it at top left corner. So these are pretty self-explanatory. Account, this is my account, CEMU account. It comes with the default account, and then debug. And crash dump is disabled. I don't want additional files on my laptop, so I'm gonna keep it disabled. So that was our general settings for the emulator. Now let's dig into the game settings. So start, favorite, edit name, wiki page, game directory, save directory. These are pretty self-explanatory. So I'm just gonna go in edit graphics packs, and this is really important. So this is community made graphics pack, and I'm just gonna download the latest community graphics packs. I'm gonna check the version, and these are available, and yes, I want to update them. So it's gonna extract and install, so it shouldn't take long. Yep, I think it's done. Okay, so here you can select the resolution of your game, 720p, 540, 900. So if you have a low-end PC, a really low-end PC with an integrated graphics card, you can select the lower resolutions. But try the default first. But if it doesn't work, you get lower FPS, then select these lower resolutions. I have it selected on Full HD. And in this game, there's only resolution available, but in other games like Breath of the Wilds, you have so many options. Like there are cheats and other performance-related options, but they're also pretty self-explanatory. So I don't have that installed here, but I think you get the gist. So that's our graphics pack. Now we're gonna get into the game settings. Wow, it's loading. I didn't actually want it to load. So I'm just gonna close that and relaunch it. So let's go into the game profile, the game settings. First, it used to be here, but now they've implemented into the individual games. So first we have general. Load shared libraries, definitely enable that whether you're on high-end PC or low-end PC. So you're gonna load your shared libraries, C++ or any other Qt libraries. Definitely enable that. Launch with gamepad view, no, we're not gonna enable that. Mode is auto, so This is for debugging purposes. Single core interpreter is going to give you really bad performance, but if you're looking for a bug, you would select that. And these aren't really that useful, only for debugging purposes. I've set it to auto. You can also set it to multi-core recompiler, depends how many cores your CPU have, but leave it to auto, so let the emulator decide. And here we have thread quantum cycles. This comes with 20,000 cycles with default. So thread in an emulator or in programming, thread is born, then started, then processed, executed, finished, and then died. So that's a life cycle of a thread. And we want 20,000 cycles of those threads, if that makes sense. Sorry if it's too complicated, because this is a little programming related. So 20,000 cycles, and some games suffer from cycle starvation problem. And in those cases, you would enable 45,000, 60,000, 80,000 cycles, or 100,000 cycles. So the games that have cycle starvation problem, you would enable those higher cycles. But if you do come across that problem, please increase it marginally. So I would increase it to 45,000. If my issue is not fixed, I would then increase it to 60,000. But first, I would keep it to 20,000. And keep in mind that if you increase your cycles, you might take a toll on your performance. It's not always, but it can happen. So keep it to default. And if you think that your game is running slowly, it might have a cycle starvation problem. So it's worth increasing these in margins. So it's worth trying out. I think the default implementation it's the best implementation, so you wouldn't need to select the higher cycle counts. And in graphics, we only have one option, shader mole accuracy. We've set it to true. It can take a toll on your performance, so you can say minimal, but I always set it to true even on low-end PCs, because the performance toll isn't that much. It's barely noticeable. So definitely keep it to true. And then we have controller. We have our controller profiles that I mentioned earlier. Which profile do we want to be assigned to this game? A. For controller 2, I want S. So something along those lines. So I think that's it. That pretty much covers it. And now I'm going to tell you the recommended settings for low-end to mid-end PCs. Keep in mind that this emulator is great. It was a handheld console. That means that the guts of this emulator aren't as powerful as other full-fledged console. So that's why it can emulate very accurately, and its performance is also amazing. So let's do the settings for low-end PCs. So I would go into general settings, use these as default, use Vulkan first to make sure that it's actually compatible. But if you get some compatibility issues, you would fall back on OpenGL. Keep in mind that OpenGL has the best implementation out of the two. So first select Vulkan, but if you suffer some issues, some artifacts in your games, select OpenGL. Audio, I've selected XA Audio 2, and that's it. And in here, I would choose 20,000 cycle, or you can also choose 45,000 cycle. Depends. If you have some specific problem, you can select 45,000, but try to keep it low, because we don't want to put that much workload. And keep it to true. So that's your settings for low-end PCs. And in graphics pack, in resolution, you will select 720p. And if you get lower FPS, then you would want to experiment with these three resolutions. Now let's talk about high-end PCs. So if you have a mid-end to high-end PC, You will go into general settings, go to graphics, OpenGL always. But if you're playing Breath of the Wild or any open world game, you use Vulkan. Depends on the title. And then leave this enabled. And audio overlay, same. And in-game profile, you will leave it to auto, and you can actually increase the cycles to 100,000 if your computer can support the workload, because I think in some cases it can give you some better accuracy. I will leave it to true, and that's it. So there you have it, guys, the complete guide to CEMU 1.22.7. It's applicable to all the emulator revisions, so it doesn't really matter what version it is, as long as they don't make drastic changes. This guide is going to be validated. So if they make some drastic changes, or if they implement a new feature, or maybe a DirectX renderer, I would make a new tutorial, or I would just update you guys on that. So anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed this tutorial. Thank you so much for watching. Catch you guys later.